Welcome back to Not Quite My Tempo with Chris. This weekend we have the latest film from Pixar and the still going Toy Story franchise, Toy Story 5. Directed by Andrew Stan and McKenna Harris, Woody, Buzz, Jessie, and the rest of the gang's jobs are challenged when they're introduced to electronics, a new threat to playtime. When they announced this movie a few years ago, I thought it was insane. It wasn't really a surprising move for Disney to announce with how many sequels and remakes they've been doing for years now, and are still doing a ton of them. Before this movie, a trailer for the live-action Moana movie played. They love their sequels and remakes, and I love a good sequel if it's meaningful and has a good story to tell following the previous film, and Toy Story 2 and 3 were definitely worthy sequels. I wasn't the biggest fan of 4, but I thought it was an okay enough reason to continue things, even if they really would have been great stopping after 3. Toy Story 3 is one of the earliest movies I remember seeing in theaters. I was like 4 years old, and I watched that movie a ton growing up. It's my favorite Pixar movie. I think it's just the perfect ending and such an emotional movie. Perhaps the perfect family movie. 4 was pushing it a little for me, but it was alright. It had some purpose, but it didn't quite have the same magic. And now we have Toy Story 5, and while it's better than I expected it to be, I still think this most recent film in the franchise is mostly unnecessary and lacks the magic of the original films. So I want to start with the good for this film because there is some strong parts of this story I wasn't expecting much from. When we're talking about parts of the story I was not looking forward to and wondering how it would be handled, that is the main conflict being the toys being replaced by iPads and technology. The idea of iPad kids and how early kids have access to technology these days and the effects it has on them. When they announced that as sort of the angle of this movie and the technology being the villains, my initial reaction was that it sounded pretty dumb. I get that this is a modern issue that was not a thing when the original Toy Story films back in the day came out, so tackling this issue with the Toy Story franchise in the modern day maybe had something to it, but I thought it sounded like a silly idea and I couldn't get over how much of a cash grab this seemed like. I did not expect much from this story and thought it was a silly way to once again bring this franchise back after ending it. But to its credit, I think the technology idea was handled much smarter and more compelling than I thought it was going to be. When they announced this as the conflict, I was wondering just how interesting the technology being the villain would be, if it would get more silly and basic than actually having anything to say on the issue. The original Toy Story films tackled themes of insecurity, abandonment, change, moving on in life, in ways that were really compelling and used the toy concept to tackle real-world ideas and relatable themes. And here I think they accomplished something similar with this story. You have this tablet come into Bonnie's life and how she gets addicted to it and faces peer pressure from her friends. She loses interest in the toys, and the toys face this fear of being left behind, and also how this tablet is affecting Bonnie's ability to make real friends and just get outside and away from the screens. But then you get points in the film where it doesn't just bash the idea of technology, and it does acknowledge some of the benefits of their existence and what they can make possible. So many advancements and new inventions have their positives and negatives, and a lot of their effects come down to how they are used, what people do with them. And this movie tackles that in a smart way, how kids shouldn't be on their screens all day, every day, without spending real time with their friends, and how it can hurt kids socializing. But it also tackles how these devices can be useful and have their positives when used appropriately. It made the story and conflict much more engaging. It's not just a simple idea of what if we made the iPads the villain and the toys are fighting the devices. It has more to it than that with the nuance it brings to the issue, treating the devices not just as villains, but a part of life today that has good and bad depending on how it's used, and there needs to be responsibility and discretion on how they work into kids' lives, the way it's used. So that concept that could have been very simple and dull ends up having more to it than I thought. And it also ties into this idea of abandonment that the toys are fearing that, while this has been done many times before in this franchise, hits some emotions here. You have Jessie as the main character here who's been a little bit sidelined since her introduction in the second film, and it takes the heartbreaking backstory they gave her in Toy Story 2 with the abandonment she faced and making her the lead as the toy's status is at risk again, and manages to give Jessie more strong moments, tying into her backstory and bringing the themes together. There's some moments here with Jessie and her on this journey, and how it ties into these themes of abandonment that, again, a lot of the Toy Story films have dealt with these ideas before. It still really hits those highs at points, though. Joan Cusack also gives a wonderful voice performance here, just some of Jessie's best moments in the franchise. Another thing I want to mention is the animation. Definitely the best of the franchise with just advancements in technology over the years. It looks as colorful and vibrant as ever. And stylistically, there's some new techniques used for the franchise with these playtime sequences and bringing the imagination of kids playing to life with the animation style. There's some beautiful and creative stuff there. So in a few ways, this movie was better than I expected and has some emotions this franchise is known for. The device angle is handled much more nuanced and smartly than I expected. Some beautiful animation and moments with Jessie. But there are also plenty of ways this movie feels redundant and unnecessary as a film in the Toy Story franchise. Starting with the adventure side of this movie with the flow of the plot, it feels very derivative. One of the toys gets separated from the rest of the gang and has to make it back home. There's a big chase of some sort in the finale. Some new toys get introduced along the way. The device angle is something new, but again, a lot of it goes back to that theme of fear of abandonment and insecurity that this franchise has also done so many times before. The device angle is new and modern, and there's some intelligence and emotion, but a lot of times this feels like they're going through the motions of a Toy Story movie with the format of the plot and the type of action. And I hate to say that about the franchise. Those original films are such magical movies, and with this movie once again pushing the franchise past another conclusion film to get another sequel out, with having some redundancy, a lot of the magic is gone when you compare this to those original films. Another part of this movie that is very weak that was also a problem in the fourth film, the ensemble is very poorly used. Those original films, it felt like even the most minor of characters had some memorable moment, whether it be a fun bit, an emotional beat, a lot of times both. The Gang of Toys truly felt like a family where every character mattered and had a presence in the story. And with these last two films, so many characters are sidelined and just fall into the background. In this film, Woody's return and inclusion feels so forced and unauthentic. His relationship with the gang and the dynamic with everyone just isn't very strong. And you do get some strong stuff with Jesse being the focus here, but when you think how good the whole group dynamic was, that is definitely missed for me in these last two films. And with so many important elements of the franchise missing and it feeling not as fresh with the stories, these last two films unfortunately feel more like cash grabs than they do actually having a fully meaningful reason for existing. There's also a subplot here that is kind of going on in the background for most of the story that ends up tying in later, that felt very forced and felt like a lazy way to throw in some bits and action. It felt very detached from everything else. So this plot felt quite basic at points with the structure and adventure side of things, and we're definitely at a point now where I don't really know what's left to do with these characters, and story-wise, it's time to finally let this franchise rest. We'll see how Disney feels about the piles of cash this movie is about to make, though. Would not be surprised if we got more Toy Story films after 5. Overall, Toy Story 5 has some fun adventure that kids and families can enjoy. The technology story had more nuance and intelligence to it than I was expecting, and Jessie as the lead gets some of her best moments in the franchise here. But with a redundant story format, some messy storylines, and characters feeling sidelined and not having much purpose in the story, this film lacks the magic of the original trilogy and doesn't fully justify its existence. It's solid, but let's end it here, please. I give Toy Story 5 a 73 out of 100. That's going to be it for me today on Not Quite My Tempo with Chris. I'll be back on Wednesday with a top 5 Steven Spielberg movie ranking, but until then, enjoy.